If war should break out, no one can estimate when it will end. But woe to him who sets Europe alight and first throws the match into the powder barrel. Those words were said by General von Moltke, German chief of staff, and one of the lead planners of the German war effort. He said those prophetic words before the war broke out. And as a table setting to our discussion today, it's appropriate to take a look and just frame this armed conflict and our analysis, our discussion that's going to follow. I want to invite you as we go along, use the emoji reacts. I know that's a very 21st century thing to do when talking about a conflict at the beginning of the 20th century. But please show some reactions, interact in the chat with each other. Let us know where you're from. We love seeing where in the world folks are tuning in from, and just share your thoughts as we go along. We love to see that discussion. So World War I is a lot of things. If you leave here with nothing else, understand that this war is an incredibly complex one. It gets boiled down into these sort of ethereal thoughts, these images that come to your mind when you hear the term World War I. Things like trench warfare, artillery, big guns, lots of explosions, newfangled weaponry, like machine guns or tanks, or even the advent of air combat as airplanes, a new invention to human beings, were first used in conflict. But the war itself, as complex as it was aptly named a world war. We really hadn't seen a conflict like this as it erupted in the middle to late part of 1914. So just as a table setting here, so that you understand, the war is between two central entities. You have the Central Powers led by Germany and Austria-Hungary. You also have the Triple Alliance between the UK, France, and Russia, who would come together and clash. Understand these aren't the only parties to the armed conflict. It really roped in all of Europe, portions of Africa, etc. This was a massively scaled armed conflict. You see the Ottoman Empire is roped in there with the Central Powers, but those are your key players, allies, as we'll call them, and the Central Powers led by Germany. It's a two-front war. So you see on the left there that orange dashed line, that's going to be your Western Front. And then that red dashed line across Russia, that forms as your Eastern Front in the conflict. It is hard to properly encapsulate the scale of this war. And I'm not always a big fan of using statistics to try to illustrate a point, because I think at a certain point, numbers can just become detached from reality. They become abstract in and of themselves. But World War I really begs to be at least framed by some of the numbers involved. And I want to start with combat deaths. So the UK, France, and Russia, so the Russian Empire, right? You don't have the USSR at this point in time. Combat deaths. So we're not talking overall casualties, wounded, or deaths by accident or some other thing. We're talking hostile fire deaths. You see here, the UK suffered 750,000. France closing in on 1.5 million. Russia closing in on 2 million hostile fire related deaths. Those in the aggregate are, large, but if you put them together, that 3.8 million, that would be as if today, 2025, you were to simultaneously wipe out the US cities of Philadelphia, Dallas, and San Francisco all together. Collectively, that population would bump close to the number of combat deaths that were suffered by just those three countries. We're not talking combat deaths suffered by Germany, Austria-Hungary, et cetera, et cetera. Just those three countries would represent these three major US cities wiped out. And this was done in a relatively short period, about 4.5 years. Compare those to the World War II combat death losses by the same country. same countries. The UK, France, and Russia. The Russian number on the right there is just Russia. So at the time, we're not going to include uh, other sort of USSR satellite type countries. This is that 6.75 million is just Russia, but tremendously different in scale. And I think the way that we think about World War II and its scale and level of destruction compared to World War I, that really throws this into sharp relief. The U.S., for its part, lost 53,000 soldiers, according to the VA, in combat deaths. That, understand, is over the course of 8 months. 8 months of combat time because the U.S. entered the war at such a late stage. U.S. troops really didn't get involved. I mean, the U.S. declared war very late in 1917, and then U.S. troops first, after they're mobilized and take all the time to get over to Europe, they really see their first combat action in the spring of 1918. The war would end in November of that year. So in that short span, 53,000 deaths. To frame that, that would be 21% of the U.S.'s entire U.S. combat deaths in the European theater during World War II. So you're talking D-Day, Battle of the Bulge, these epic sort of historical battles of World War II. To frame that even further, in the entire Vietnam War, we suffered a little over 47,000 combat deaths. So in 8 months of combat in World War I, we suffered more combat deaths than we did in the entire Vietnam conflict. To put this in a little more specificity, one battle, the destructive capacity of a single battle, the Battle of the Somme, which was fought for several months in the middle to latter part of 1916 in France. Here you see the complex lines and troop laydown of British and German forces. British day one of the battle. So that battle lasted July to November. Day one in July, 57,470 casualties suffered by the British Army alone. Again, no other parties, just that's the British number. 19,000 killed. It's the single deadliest day for the British Army, British Armed Forces in their entire history of existence. Total casualties for that conflict, that single battle of the conflict, 1.1 million. Just an absolutely mind-boggling number to think about, and that's one campaign, one battle within a 4+ year war. So the destructive capability, the destructive effects of this armed conflict really are unmatched in numerically and otherwise in other conflicts across the 19th, 20th centuries, and even before that. To get to the law of the armed conflict side of things, the reason that you're all here, and I'll use law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law as interchangeable terms, but to understand the interplay of IHL, of LOAC, you have to understand where that body of law stood in 1914. To put an end to these incessant armaments, which are threatening the whole world, is the supreme duty which is today imposed on all states. Those words spoken by Tsar Nicholas II in 1898, ahead of what we'll discuss as the First Hague Convention. He serves as the Russian emperor, and we'll touch a little bit more on his role in that conference. At this point in time, the definition, generally speaking, of IHL is the same as it is today. It's a body of international law, a subset of international law that seeks to limit the destructive effects of armed conflict, to reduce human suffering during armed conflict. That is the same then as it is today. And when you speak about IHL to many people, the first thing that jumps to their mind, if anything, is going to be the Geneva Conventions, understandably. And when folks think of the Geneva Conventions, they may not be able to articulate this, but what they're probably thinking about are GCs 1 through 4, the modern day Geneva Conventions that are still good law today. Understand that those 4 conventions came into being in 1949, so decades after World War I. They were not in play in or in existence in World War One. So, sort of that foundational concept of what IHL is that rests upon a post World War II construct just isn't there. There are Geneva Conventions, though. There is a Geneva Convention, if you will, but it's one of very limited scope. The GCs that came about after World War II are relatively comprehensive. They deal with wounded on the battlefield, shipwrecked and injured folks at sea. They deal with prisoners of war, civilians, et cetera, et cetera. A very broad scope. In contrast, the Geneva Convention that is operable at the outset of World War One is much more limited in its scope. And it really has a central focus on the wounded of the battlefield and the medical care that is to be afforded to them. What you see is not a suite of 4 Geneva Conventions, but a single convention that has been updated once in the intervening years between its original signing in 1864. So that first Geneva Convention, born of the efforts of Henri Dunant of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And its focus is on those who are in need of medical care on the battlefield, so wounded soldiers and those providing care to the wounded. It's updated a few decades later in 1906. You get some expansion to address shipwrecks, so wounded sailors, folks at sea. But that's really the focus. You have some ideas bouncing around about things like prisoners of war and whatnot, but you don't have a convention, a Geneva Convention, specific to any of those things until much later after the war. What you do have in addition, or as an overlay to Geneva, are what's called the Hague Conventions. I mentioned that Tsar Nicholas quote at the beginning, and I chose Tsar Nicholas because he's the impetus, one of the main impetuses behind the original Hague Convention of 1899. I think a cynic would look at the Hague Convention, certainly the one in 1899, and say that this was a desperate ploy put into motion by Russia, a state that was falling behind in the global arms race. And this represented an attempt to claw back the moral high ground and try to even the race between Russia and its peers or near peers in the conduct of amassing armies and munitions and new technologies. That would be the cynical view. But I do think that Hague, because some of it is still good law today, remains a monumental shift or a monumental evolution in IHL at that point in time, at the point in which it came into being. And that's because the conduct of warfare at the time was largely guided by traditions and customs. So the way that armies conducted themselves on the battlefield, the things that nations did or didn't do out of a sense of obligation, not law, not by fear of committing a war crime or something like that, but we will conduct ourselves in this way, or we will refrain from doing these things because that is tradition, that is custom, that's how you do things as a professional military on the battlefield. That was sort of the centerpiece of IHL up to that point in time. Things like Geneva, this idea of trying to codify these customs into law, into international law, that was still a relatively new concept, all told. But what Geneva did was what Hague did was take that practice that Geneva had sort of kickstarted, providing a new anchor for these traditions and customs in the law, in international law, trying to ground these tenets into enforceable, respected tenets of international law, things that countries could negotiate, sign on to, and have give the sort of global community better faith that these would be adhered to and followed. Because after all, a sort of codified law as compared to, say, a tradition or a custom one's a little easier to breach than the other, at least at first blush. So Haig does this cementing customs in three sort of main buckets. One, it attempts to define individual statuses. So, wounded on the battlefield, combatants, civilians. It looks at the people on the battlefield and tries to better define the classes that those individuals fall into for purposes of affording protections to some. It also works to limit agents of war, the kind of means of warfare that were rapidly evolving around 1899, the turn of the century, as the first Hague Conference convened. It attempted to get its arms around those rapidly advancing, very destructive means of warfare and place limits on those. And then finally, and interestingly, it applied some rules for occupying powers. So countries that would go in, control an area, administer an area that was previously belonged to the opposing force, the enemy, another party. They're not annexing that, but they're controlling it for some time. So this was really monumental. You can look at Haig. It can be two things at once. It can be that cynical ploy that I mentioned by Tsar Nicholas, staring down the barrel of a rapidly advancing global society and saying, oh, hang on, there's got to be a way for Russia to not fall too far behind in all of this. Maybe we can get a moral angle on this. And it can also be a step forward in the evolution of IHL. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. And in particular, we're going to see later on in this presentation a focus on this limiting the agents of war, because Haig contains some really forward-looking aspects concerning the means and methods of warfare. Things like addressing the use of poisonous gases, the bombardment of undefended civilian towns, killing those who have surrendered, things like balloon warfare, right? A lot of these things that are cutting edge or are otherwise gaps in international law. Haig comes together, the parties to Haig, and attempt to find a way to address these things. So in many ways, if you were to crack this open right now, I think you would be surprised that this is a document that was crafted during the 19th century, albeit at the turn of the 20th century. It really is forward-looking in that way. But Haig has one critical limitation, that's going to come back to haunt the participants, the combatants, and civilians caught up in World War I. So this is the text from the Hague Convention. So in the view of the high contracting parties, these provisions are inspired by the desire to diminish the evils of war. A really great goal, I would say a central goal of IHL, beautifully put. But as the ellipses indicate on the back end there's a second part to that sentence, and that is, so far as military necessities permit. That last clause there, in lawyer speak, is a gaping hole. The idea here is that, well, we're going to limit ourselves as contracting parties, as parties to this new treaty, but we're not going to limit ourselves completely. We're going to leave open the possibility that we can argue that some things are necessary. Some of this conduct, maybe a violation of Haig, is okay, so long as it's militarily necessary. We'll abide by these rules, these lofty principles, so long as military necessity allows us. You could drive a truck through that clause, and it would come back to really haunt, I would say, the drafters and certainly the participants and those innocents caught up in the war as it breaks out in 1914. So we've set the scene for both the war and IHL as it existed in 1914. And I want to move into this notion that, and this isn't limited to World War One, but IHL, issues of IHL, or issues concerning tenets of IHL, are key shaping points in the war. However, the world pretends to divide itself. There are only two divisions in the world today: human beings and Germans. It's words said by Rudyard Kipling in 1915, English author of The Jungle Book, among many things. I pulled this quote because we're going to focus in on a turn of events, the evolution of the war, as the world, as societies reacted to the conduct of the war, how it was being fought. So again and again, you see the use of propaganda on both sides of the conflict, that has a sort of singular through line. When you look at posters like these and others, the sentiment behind them, the imagery, the words, the call to action, these are all Allied propaganda posters, but they are uniformly fueled by acts of German battlefield conduct or notions of how the Germans acted on the battlefield. Stories, maybe falsifications on one end, maybe embellishments on the other, with truth laying somewhere in the middle. But you see this powerful surge of propaganda that is feeding from reports of how the war is being fought. And I want to start in Belgium, because this is a really critical sort of turning point at the very beginning of the war that becomes known very quickly as the Rape of Belgium. So at the outset of the war, Germany has a plan to sort of end the war before it begins. It recognizes that geographically it is sandwiched between France and its powerful military on its west, and arguably the United Kingdom, and then Russia and the might of its military power on the right, on the east side. The Germans know they do not want to fight a two-front war, and so they have what's known as the Schlieffen Plan, which is designed to be this western hook to knock out France before Russia has a chance to mobilize, before England has a chance to really commit its forces and mobilize its forces in. Let's punch in, let's knock out Paris, take out France, certainly make England and the United Kingdom think twice about coming across the channel. But also, if Russia does honor its alliance and enter the war, well, then we can really just focus on a single front war. So this Schlieffen Plan is critical. It is timed out down to the hour, down to the minute by the railway routes, troop movements. Everything is precise, and it rests on this notion of hitting the French where they do not expect it, in the northeast. And you see there what lies between Germany and France, and that is the nation of Belgium. The neutral nation of Belgium. Belgium at this point in time has been neutral for a long time, long portions of its history. This is something that is sort of integrated within the national identity of Belgians. It is well known, well respected at this point in time. The idea of violating a country's neutrality is seen as sort of an arch crime. You couldn't think of more heinous crimes on the international stage than violating a country's neutrality. Yet to effectuate the Schlieffen Plan, to win the war before it starts, as the Germans want to do, they're going to have to march through Belgium to outflank the French army. They are sort of positioned on the eastern side of France in these fortifications that are very difficult to attack head on. Well, let's swing around, we'll take Paris out, and we'll outflank the French army. Belgium is seen as nothing more than a speed bump. The Germans describe them as chocolate soldiers. They're seen as this country and the people and armed forces. We're going to roll over. If they do put up any resistance, it's going to be token at best. But more likely than not, the Belgians will step aside, accept the fact that the Germans have to do this to protect themselves, as they allege, and we'll reset the playing field after the war is over, and the Belgians will be okay with that. They'll get their neutrality, they'll get their sort of national integrity back. This is just temporary. One single vision fills all minds, that our independence is endangered. One single duty imposes itself upon our wills, the duty of stubborn resistance. That was said by King Albert I of Belgium in 1914, and it was a prelude to the very different tack that the Belgian people would take in the face of an invading German army. And that was one of a stiff armed resistance. The Belgians didn't have a large army, not a well-stocked armed forces, but they did have a series of forts, these fortifications that were already outdated at the start of World War I, but which proved to be sticking points as the German army attempted to slice through Belgium like a knife through hot butter. They held up the German army. The German army encountered not chocolate soldiers, but fierce resistance from a well-organized Belgian military and Belgian civil defense, so civilians taking up arms. And it threw a wrench into that very specifically articulated Schlieffen plan, this business of planning your railway movements, planning troop movements down to the minute, rested on some assumptions, one of them being that the Belgians would step aside or that resistance would be token at best. That proved to be false. This was a consternation for Germans. They were enraged that the Belgians would resist in this way. They took far more casualties than they expected, which was obviously enraging to them. In addition, German soldiers became very paranoid of what they called free shooters, this idea of guerrilla fighters, folks dressed as civilians but taking sniper shots at German soldiers. And so you started to see very rapidly widespread civilian killings taking place. You saw a mix of that suspicion bordering on paranoia, resulting in civilian killing. So if a free shooter was suspected in a town, the German soldiers would go through and kill civilians there. You would have women and children that were victimized there. You had collective punishment happening, collective punishment being sort of the punishment of a larger civilian population because of perceived crimes or wrongs or actions done by the opposing party. So those civilians having nothing to do with it, yet getting punished anyhow. So those widespread civilian killings are stacking up. And you also have this indiscriminate destruction of Belgian civilian property. That picture there, that's from a Catholic university library, which was burned to the ground, not being used for any military purpose, but just sacked alongside 2,000 other civilian buildings. There was widespread looting of Belgian homes and businesses. And this generated a tremendous amount of outrage, not just in Belgium, but globally. So I bring you back to those propaganda posters. It started in Belgium. This is where sort of the notoriety, the infamy of the German military in World War I got its roots. And those roots were, in some ways based on true events. Certainly they were blown, they were taken out of or not context, but they were embellished. In some cases, fabrications were laid on. But there was a vein of truth in all of this that fed an outrage. And what it did on a larger scale, beyond just like an individual recruiting drive or an individual soldier's motivation, it took this armed conflict that started with the assassination of an archduke by Serbian nationalists. So this quote here from Lord Bryce is really telling. So this kind of encapsulates the arbitrary, the seeming abstractness of this conflict when it kicked off in 1914. There must be something fatally wrong with our civilization for this Serbian cause. So frightful a calamity has descended on all Europe. This idea that most of Europe is detached from this assassination, this Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who's killed and sets off this domino chain of events that results in the war. That didn't make sense to a whole lot of folks. If you were the average citizen in England, what care did you have about a royal who you've never seen before being assassinated in a far off country that you've never visited? That is a hard cause to rally your troops behind. That is a hard cause to rally allies behind. But yet, the German conduct in Belgium changed the paradigm. And so Lord Bryce put a fine point on that. The one thing we have to comfort us in this war is that we are all absolutely convinced of the justice of the cause and our duty to take up the sword. Lord Bryce is talking, of course, referencing the atrocities being committed in Belgium. That now redefines the rationale for going to war. It takes this abstractness that started with a royal assassination, sets it aside, and it cloaks it in the plight of innocent civilians in Belgium, a neutral country that wanted nothing to do with this war. Now you've given the average person something to fight for. Now you can see, going back to those posters, why when you make a call to action and you show women and children and other innocents being murdered, it is much easier for an individual or a politician to say, well, that could be me. I better fight because that could be me, or I have a duty to protect people like that. It transformed the entire course of the war. And the second example that I'll give of IHL shaping the war is in the conduct of what's known as unrestricted submarine warfare. So toward the beginning of the war, Britain had one major thing going for it. It has always had a notoriously strong navy, sort of the pride of the country, and it leveraged that navy to try to exert economic pressure on Germany through a blockade. That blockade, as you see on the right there, went into effect shortly after the war began in November of 1914, and it aimed to wall off Germany and its allies from shipping. So anything from normal goods that German civilians would need to survive to materiel that would be used in the war effort. The British Navy was there to stop it from getting into port in Germany or German-controlled territory. And it was terribly effective. So effective, in fact, that the Germans had to find a way to counter it. They declared a war zone in February around the British Isles and Ireland. And as part of that, you had submarine warfare that was initiated. Now, submarines were a relatively new wartime invention. Obviously, they date back decades before this, but U-boats, as the Germans called them, if you didn't know what that was, what the U in U-boats meant, it's an Unterseeboot. So German is a wonderful language that gets right to the point there. So your Unterseeboots boots are out at sea, prowling the waters around England. Germany has about 20 operational U-boats at the start of the war, and they are incredibly effective against, at least when they can find and fire on Allied vessels. They are very effective. You don't have the sort of technology that you have later in the 20th century to track and identify submarines. Even today, subs are very difficult to track as they're underwater. The Germans recognize this and were using U-boats to their advantage. Now, the unrestricted part of unrestricted submarine warfare has a particular character. And here, what it meant was that all hostile merchant ships and neutral merchant ships would be destroyed without warning. The without warning is critical here, as is the merchant ship part, because a merchant ship is not a warship. A merchant ship is not a battleship. It's not a cruiser. It is not a warship of any type. It is a commercial vessel. Now, the law of the sea at the time afforded opposing navies the ability to stop and search merchant vessels. There were sort of well-regarded rules surrounding this. They became known as prize rules. But this business of destroying them without warning to the crew, without a chance for them to evacuate the ship or be rescued, that was different. That was unheard of at the time, and it was not well regarded. I rope in neutral vessels because Germany specifically said they are not going to guarantee the safety of neutral vessels. They alleged that Britain was flying neutral colors to hide or mask some of its merchant ships. And they said, we're not going to stop and try to figure out who's who. We're going to blow up everything. And then for German U-boat commanders, their central primary duty was the safety of their vessel. The protection of their crew and their vessel was paramount. The business of trying to figure out who's who in the crosshairs of their periscope, that was secondary. So if it appears to be an enemy in any form, a non-German ship, go ahead and destroy it so long as you stay safe. This was unprecedented. And it's at this part in the story where a liner called the Lusitania comes into play. Now, the Lusitania, this is a video, the last video taken of the Lusitania. This is it leaving on its final voyage before it meets its awful fate. If it looks familiar, that's because it is a familiar design. So this ship was a passenger liner. It was very well appointed on the inside. You see some photos here of some of the first class areas, and that four-stack design really evokes a Titanic imagery. And in fact, Cunard Lines, the company that operated the Lusitania, one of its main rivals, business-wise, not war-wise, but business-wise, was the White Star Line. So they had the Olympic class of vessels, of which the Titanic was one of those vessels in that class. The Titanic had gone down 2 years prior in 1912, but the Lusitania is, when it was built, the largest vessel of its kind. It was only, outclassed by increments in the intervening years, but at this point in time, it had held the record for fastest transatlantic voyage. This was a truly impressive ship and a first-rate way to get across the Atlantic. And the Lusitania was scheduled to go from New York to Liverpool at the outset of the war. Also advertised alongside there was a notice that the Imperial German Embassy took out in about 50 newspapers across the country with this warning on it, a warning about the state of war that existed around the British Isles and the danger posed to passengers on ships like the Lusitania. Now, there's controversy about whether passengers who were thinking about buying a ticket on the Lusitania's voyage would have seen this notice. I ask you to step back and think about that. Think about if you're on AmericanAirlines.com or Delta, Kayak.com, and you were trying to book an airline ticket to wherever, and you get a pop-up notice that says, hey, by the way, a war is happening here. Your plane might be shot down because of this war that's going on. That would be a pretty stark thing. And so a notice like this wouldn't have gone just ignored by passengers. But understandably, if you're in need to cross over, there is no transatlantic air flight at this time, and you're probably playing the odds. You're thinking, well, the British Navy is really good. They're probably protecting, all sorts of vessels in that area and fighting off the Germans. Also, the ocean is big. This ship is big, but small in the context of the ocean. How likely is it that our ship is going to come into contact with a German vessel? And also, this is a civilian ship. I'm not taking passage on some Navy destroyer. I'm on a civilian vessel. And so folks boarded it in spite of the warnings. And uh, you see the track of the Lusitania. It was supposed to swing around south of Ireland, come into Liverpool to its final destination. But off that southern coast of Ireland, it runs into calamity. And that calamity is known as U-20, German U-boat in service in that area. And the U-boat identifies the Lusitania. The captain, in his own wartime diary, notes that he recognized the Lusitania. There wasn't some mistake that this was a military vessel. He recognized it as it was a well-known ship at the time. There weren't that many transatlantic liners like this one of this size and notoriety. And they fire a torpedo at it. The torpedo direct hits in broad daylight on the side of the hull, and the Lusitania goes down in mere minutes off the southern coast of Ireland with no warning given to the ship, its crew, or the passengers aboard. And the captain, in his just a few minutes after the strike happens, he makes a note in his diary. It says, "It looks as if the ship will only stay afloat for a very short time. I couldn't have fired another torpedo into the mass of humans desperately trying to save themselves." It's Walter Schweiger, the commander of U-20. Almost 1,200 are dead. That's 61% of the passengers who were aboard at the time, and it causes international outrage. There are more than 100 U.S. citizens aboard the Lusitania. This sinking makes headlines across the country, from the East Coast to the West Coast. Locations in between. There's a Pittsburgh paper, heck, even the Topeka Star out of Kansas is covering this. And it again becomes a really powerful vein of propaganda that is fueling talk, not just about joining the war for citizens in Britain or France or elsewhere. It is a motivating factor amongst many, to include Teddy Roosevelt, former president, that the U.S. should enter the war, that it is high time, beyond time, that the U.S. get off the sidelines and get involved, because look at what this enemy is doing. They have no regard for civilian life. It is time for the U.S. to come to the aid of allies and in part avenge the Lusitania, perhaps prevent atrocities like this. And in fact, the propaganda, much of it has a legal tinge to it. Look at this. This appalling crime was contrary to international law and the conventions of all civilized nations. This is a poster that's going out to the public, and it's specifically referencing an arm of IHL. It says a lot about what was motivating the public at the time. The Germans understandably recognized the backlash and the boiling rage that was happening in the wake of this. They came out in response and alleged that the Lusitania was in fact carrying munitions for allies in the war. So this was not some neutral civilian vessel. It was also carrying arms. But the public really didn't care. That didn't land well with the public. The source of public outrage was that you gave civilians on the vessel no warning and no means to be rescued. And so that nearly 1,200 dead, that casualty number, was like unreasonably high given the circumstances. I don't think there was anybody that was arguing that the Germans had no right to target a military vessel or something carrying military materiel, but the idea that you would give no warning to a vessel full of civilians and sort of ruthlessly attack them, that was beyond the pale for the public, both in Europe and in America. The United States narrowly avoided entering the war. The president at the time, President Wilson, secured an agreement from Germany, that they would obey the law, that they would back off unrestricted submarine warfare. So you have a categorical shift in the tactics of the German Navy as a direct result of the outcry following the Lusitania. The US didn't enter the war, so the Germans avoided that sort of catastrophe, but that didn't last for long, because in 1917, early that year, the Germans, facing an increasingly bleak war outlook, took back up the cause of unrestricted submarine warfare. That, among other things, brought America into the war. The US, in no small part because of this conduct of the war, came in, declared war in late 1917. US troops would be on the ground in 1918 fighting. And a fun fact, if you visit this very unremarkable Hilton, it looks like it has a nice pool, I guess, the Hilton Anatoly Hotel on a freeway in Dallas, Texas, you will find, amongst an unremarkable hotel, one of the propellers from the Lusitania. So if you happen to be needing to stay at a hotel on the outskirts of Dallas, you can also see a component of the Lusitania there. You can tell them Thomas sent you. I am going to go over, I know for those watching live, we're coming up on the top of the hour. So if you have to go, I understand. Please check this video back out on YouTube, or you can come back tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern time, and I'll be giving a live encore of this, or you can check it out on YouTube. I thank you if you do have to leave for attending, and I hope you've learned something so far. But we'll move on to the next phase of our analysis here, and that's the business of military advances and their intersection with IHL. My dear wife, I have been wounded. Care well for the children. Leopold will help you if I don't get out of this. I have a crushed thigh, and I'm alone in a shell hole. I hope they will soon come fetch me. My last thought is of you. Second Lieutenant Jean-Louis Cros of the 201st Infantry Regiment, French Army. World War I was a turning point, quite literally, in the conduct of war. The introduction of things like the machine gun, armored weaponry such as tanks, aircraft, it represented one of the most seismic shifts in the way that wars are fought as compared to any other conflict in history. This was a transitional point from the sort of old world wars of the 19th century and before. You know, this idea of two armies clashing in the field, going at it in true honorable style, and then marching off the field of battle to fight another day. World War I and the technology that accompanied it changed all of that. That's from the movie War Horse. And I mean it very literally when I say the old world met the new in bloody fashion as this war broke out. Armies, to include the best armies of the world, the French army, one of the most well-regarded, battle-tested armies in the world at the time. I know they catch flack nowadays, but the French army was, very well regarded at this time. They were still steeped in the traditions of the 19th century, the tactics and techniques of warfare of that last century. At the start of the war, you'd probably be surprised that if I told you this is an image of French cavalry at the start of the war. They're wearing the sort of regalia into battle that French cavalry had worn at the turn of the 19th century, almost 100 years prior. You had cavalry charges like the one that I showed in the clip from that movie War Horse just a second ago at the outset of the war, because armies, both in technology and in tactics, were still anchored in those old ways of fighting, even as new methods of death and destruction came into being. And it's with that spirit that I want to take you to the overall map of World War One. We mentioned we've got the Western Front and the Eastern Front here. At this point in time, this is 1915. You've really kind of devolved into a stalemate along these lines. Much of the trench warfare that you have probably heard some degree about is existing along these lines. And we're going to go to a city called Ypres in Western Belgium. And this is the site of part of that line. And at a section of that line, there's a small bump out. The line sort of bubbles out in one area. And the Germans are determined to attack there in order to break French, British, and Canadian lines, to allow the retreat of other German forces so that they can reposition those divisions to reinforce Central Powers fighting elsewhere in the war. They need to punch this hole to cover that retreat, and Ypres is the place that they elect to do that. I'm going to take you to the 22nd of April, 1915. Ypres, this isn't the first time that Ypres has seen fighting. The first Battle of Ypres took place in bloody fashion at the end of 1914. Allies held that area. Ypres, although it's not a major city, was a key strategic point for the Allies. It held a key railway hub. It was one of the last Belgian cities to be held by the Allies, so it was a strategic point of importance, and this is where fighting broke out again. 1700 hours, so 5 p.m. in the afternoon that day. Suddenly we saw to the north of us this yellow wall moving quite slowly towards our line. We didn't have any idea what it was. Archibald James, British Royal Flying Corps. We heard this sizzling and then saw this awful cloud, a great greenish yellow cloud. Nobody knew what to think. Then it got to our position, and you immediately began to choke. Martin Greener, British Army officer. Ypres was the site of the first gas attack of World War I. Confusion, chaos, and terror reigned as this greenish-yellow cloud descended upon a portion of the battlefield that afternoon. Everywhere were soldiers without weapons, haggard, running around like madmen, begging for water in loud cries, some even rolling on the ground, making desperate efforts to breathe. Henri Mordac, French soldier. What they were experiencing, despite not knowing precisely how to describe it or what it was the first gas attack of World War I, a gas attack involving weaponized chlorine gas released, as you see here, onto the battlefield. And I want to talk about poison gas weapons using that Ypres gas attack as a vehicle to discuss it. So in the lead up to the Second Battle of Ypres, the Germans secretly dug in 6,000 canisters along a multi-kilometer line, a 6-kilometer line of the front, containing 15 tons of weaponized chlorine gas. I say weaponized, they had researched with the help of a German chemist the ability to take this aerosolized version of chlorine and encapsulate it in a way that could be deployed onto the battlefield in a cloud. As wind conditions changed and became favorable, a special unit wearing protective gear of the German army released this gas. It flooded southward across French-Algerian lines just to the west of Canadian forces on the line. And within minutes, it was having a devastating effect on the soldiers. The line broke almost immediately. The effect was so fast and so complete that it caught the Germans by surprise, who were not prepared to take full advantage of just how fast that portion of the line would collapse under the cloud of gas. What we saw was total death. Nothing was alive. The smell of gas was still in the air. The bodies of French soldiers were everywhere. You could see where men had clawed at their faces and throats, trying to get breath. Some had shot themselves. Everything, even the insects, was dead. Willie Siebert, German soldier, part of the German forces pushing across the line after the gas attack at Ypres. Chlorine gas, this isn't a science class, but just understand that as a weaponized component, when chlorine gas enters the lungs, it reacts with the water contained naturally within your lungs. It forms hydrochloric acid. It is destructive to tissue. It can result in very quick death, in a sort of choking, suffocating feeling. You, in effect, drown without being under any water whatsoever. Now, I know what you're saying. You said, Thomas, I was here for the beginning of the presentation. You said that the Hague Convention of 1899 specifically banned asphyxiating gases. And that seems to be exactly what chlorine gas is. It is causing an asphyxiating effect, right? And I would say you are correct on both points, both about the chlorine gas and the Hague Convention. But understand, here is the language pertinent to gases from Hague Convention. The contracting powers agree to abstain from the use of projectiles, the sole object of which is the diffusion of asphyxiating, say that 10 times fast, or deleterious gases. That seems to be right on point. That seems to aptly describe chlorine gas, right? Well, the word projectiles becomes a hinge point in all of this, because German forces look at that and they say, well, projectile means something that is fired, an artillery shell, a bullet, some sort of projected munition. We are taking chlorine gas and releasing it from canisters, basically from barrels. And the Hague Convention says nothing about that. So what we're doing is okay. So they do this sidestep around the law. It's not an ignorant, like an ignoring of the law, so much as it is creative lawyering in the spirit of trying to justify some military necessity that's perceived in using this terrible weapon. So they hinge on this projectile nature of it. They use these cans, and it is controversial within the German ranks. Poisoning the enemy as one would rats affected me as it would any straightforward soldier. I was disgusted. So I know we've talked a lot about German conduct in the war, and just understand that the purpose in bringing that up or using that lens is not to paint with a broad brush. The propaganda did that for its own purposes. There was dissension among the ranks on both sides of the war when it came to how some aspects of the war were being conducted. I pull this quote in particular because how a war is conducted, the humanity or lack thereof, has an absolute effect on those fighting. German officers like this have a conscience. They are human beings, even though they are being asked to do unspeakable and, in many cases, unhuman things every day. When they're being put in a position to have to do things that violate their own moral code, or in their eyes violate some custom or tradition, or certainly the law itself, that itself can have a profoundly negative effect. It can have a negative psychological effect, can have a negative effect on morale, et cetera, et cetera. So there was dissension even amongst the German ranks about the use of a weapon like this. The legal two-stepping around this word projectile would quickly fall away, and I mentioned that business of military necessity, that gaping hole in the in Hague would come back to bite us, and this is a great example of it because almost immediately, both sides of the conflict not only start to use poisonous gases of various types, but they start to use them as projectiles within artillery barrages, as a component of artillery barrages to try to flush soldiers out, and then follow on with typical or more traditional high explosive rounds, etc. And the rallying point, if there was one, was that business of military necessity. Well, we would love to comply with Hague, but that's not practical. This is militarily necessary, and we have to do it. Chlorine gas was but one type of poisonous gas or asphyxiating gas used in World War I. They were used by both sides of the conflict, and there was a bunch of different types of them. One of the most deadly, despite the awful effects that I illustrated with chlorine, was actually phosgene gas. Phosgene gas is colorless. It has just a musty odor, an odor that could be mistaken for maybe like old hay or grass, something that you might otherwise encounter out on the battlefield anyways. But phosgene had is probably the gas that's responsible for the vast majority of gas-related casualties. There is nothing more liable to cause panic than the idea of being choked, the dread of being slowly strangled. Colonel A. Bertram Soltau, French medical specialist in treating gas attack injuries. This weapon was not just designed to kill an enemy soldier. This wasn't a bullet. This wasn't a traditional artillery round designed to kill, take down an enemy soldier. There was a psychological terror component that was part of the design of these weapons. This was designed to not just be effective at killing or flushing out soldiers from their positions, but it was designed to induce absolute chaos, to strike fear into the hearts of soldiers who were being faced down with it. And again, that is borne out in the experiences of soldiers who not only experienced it firsthand, the horrible injuries and deaths that resulted from these gas attacks, but the treatment of for those that survived was horrendous. In many cases, really palliative care is about all you could offer. With something like chlorine gas, there was no treatment for it. You would make the patient as comfortable as you could. On the other extreme, something like mustard gas took an incredibly complex and resource-intensive set of medical treatment that was not available to your average victim of a mustard gas attack somewhere on a far-flung end of the front. But if a soldier was lucky enough to be taken back to the rear to a medical facility with adequate means, they demanded, that's a single soldier would demand a tremendous amount of resources to save them from death. And even in that the business of saving them, they would still be put through an excruciating amount of suffering. IHL encompasses the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering, the business of not using means or methods of warfare that induce suffering for suffering's sake. Gas attacks, gas weapons, in general, that is, if there was a textbook definition of unnecessary suffering, it is within that weapon. Word of these gas attacks would spread around the world in the same vein as things like the Lusitania. The horrors that these types of weapons induced would shock the conscience of the world. And the numbers are staggering. There were 130,000 tons of poison gas produced during the war, 1.3 million gas casualties, and within that, about 100,000 deaths from gas. And this isn't a bullet wound where you're shot, you fall, and you're dead immediately. In many cases, this is probably one of the worst deaths imaginable, as you choke and drown on liquids produced in your own body. Just truly awful stuff. And to put that in context, that 100,000 number, this is Bryant-Denny Stadium, a large college football stadium at the University of Alabama here in the United States. That's the entire stadium wiped out, fully packed, sold out for a football game, gone as a result of just gas attacks. Forget everything else, all the artillery, all the other types of means and methods of fighting World War I. Just gas attacks wiped out that entire stadium worth of people. So again, I bring us back to The Hague and to those who would say, well, the convention barred this. How dare countries use German, British, French, whoever? How dare that they violate this sacrosanct element, this new element of international law? Well, the devil is in that trapdoor that, so far as military necessities permit, beguiled combatants, civilians, politicians alike in the conduct of the war, because it became this blank check that could justify any amount of destruction, death, or suffering. Because you can take just about anything and make some stretch of an argument that it's militarily necessary. So I wish I could tell you that in the wake of World War I, there was a tremendous global push towards accountability for IHL violations, towards evolving substantially the treaties governing IHL. But unfortunately, there wasn't. There were some pushes. One of those specifically related to the horrors presented by gas warfare, and that was the 1925 Geneva Protocol on asphyxiating or poisonous gases. This banned these weapons outright, and it received near universal support from countries. And it stands alongside the Geneva Convention of 1929, which addressed prisoners of war, in no small part because of the horrors that POWs faced during World War I, as a couple of the only significant evolutions of IHL that would precede World War II. But it fed directly from the awfulness of that weapon and the suffering that was endured by countless soldiers on all sides of the war. I'm going to leave you with a poem about this.
Gas, gas, quick boys. An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori.